reforming politicized budgetary bodies, and protecting the human rights pillar from further disproportionate cuts. Ultimately, defending the human rights budget is not a technical issue. It's a test of political will and moral leadership. The UN cannot credibly champion human rights if its member states do not fund them. Before introducing you to our esteemed panel today, we asked Kyle Ward, former Chief of Program Support and Management Services of OHCHR, to share a historical perspective on the structural challenges to UN human rights funding and budget negotiations. Kyle couldn't be here with us today, but graciously sent us a video message that we could share.
Greetings from Geneva. My name is Kyle Ward, and I was the Chief of Program Support and Management Services at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for 15 years, starting in 2006. In that capacity, I was responsible for the preparation, presentation, and defense of OHCHR budgets before the General Assembly, as well as the financing requirements for all the mandates of the Human Rights Council. As you can imagine, this involved many long hours spent with the ACABQ and FITS committee multiple times each year, as well as ongoing outreach and consultation with member state representatives regarding the Council's decisions, both before and after their adoption, to better ensure they would receive the necessary resources for their implementation. Notwithstanding the enthusiastic acclaim with which the newly established Human Rights Council inaugurated its mandate in 2006, the United Nations Human Rights Pillar has always been and continues to be caught between competing geopolitical interests, and as a result has been and remains grossly underfunded. Although it is ostensibly one of the three core pillars of the UN system, when I joined the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights just before the Council's first session, the combined funding for the Council and its mandates, along with the Office of the High Commissioner, was barely 3% of the annual UN budget. Nearly 20 years later, despite ever-increasing mandates, that percentage has barely risen. Rare is the human rights mandate that enjoys universal support. I am sure everyone present is familiar with the protracted negotiations surrounding the adoption of every mandate by the Human Rights Council. And when mandates are adopted by vote, those who voted against them very often actively attempt to undermine or prevent their implementation in other forums. As I have noted, during my 15 years with the Office of the High Commissioner, I was engaged in annual battles with the UN machinery to obtain funds for all of the mandates established by the Human Rights Council. And in this context, the odds were stacked against us at every turn. In the first instance, the Committee for Program and Coordination, whose role is to approve the program plans of all UN regular budget programs, has approved the Human Rights Program Plan only 3 times in the past 20 years, and then only with significant modifications to weaken its position. This has been taken as a reason to question and object to the program by members of the ACABQ, which forms the first line of spending approvals and whose annual budget recommendations are almost invariably approved by the 5th Committee. The ACABQ has often been downright hostile to the Council's human rights mandates, slashing the resources required for their implementation and thus impeding their work. And that hostility has carried over to the 5th Committee, where the expressions of deepest respect and support for human rights are frequently belied by concerted efforts to deny or reduce resources for mandates those representatives' governments do not support, citing the expert advice of the independent ACABQ. In my experience, and as this report clearly shows, although all of these bodies are intended to be technical, they are intensely political, usually to the detriment of the UN's human rights work. As an example of this politicization, I recall in one visit to Moscow, I was invited to meet with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and to my surprise, I was greeted at the door by the Russian ACABQ member. While it was useful to have the opportunity to give more nuance to the High Commissioner's plans for the implementation of Council mandates and reassurances of our impartiality, I have no doubt that it was also their intention to strengthen their own efforts to thwart them. Of course, compounding this politicization of funding for human rights has been the perennial financial difficulties of the UN, largely caused by the late or non-payment of dues by certain states. The current financial crisis may well be the worst in the organization's history, but it is certainly not the first. Every few years, there have been crises of one sort or another, and the consistent, though rarely achieved, demand on the Secretary General has been to prohibit growth to the organization's budget overall. Nowhere is that call repeated more than when discussing human rights funding, almost never when it comes to development or security pillars. So the successful implementation of the many mandates of the Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner over the past 20 years has thus been possible primarily due to the sustained efforts and support of friendly governments and organizations who have bravely stood up and joined these battles to hold the line for human rights funding. It is also to some extent a factor of the reality that these battle lines are somewhat fluid. Every government has programs that it likes and those that it does not. And so it is possible to find openings where a majority can be built to support mandates even in the face of strong opposition by the usual suspects. This requires concerted diplomacy, however, and persistent outreach from every angle. Government and civil society representatives such as yourselves are hugely important in this task, as are the UN's human rights colleagues. For my part, I spoke regularly with not only civil society and friendly government counterparts, but also at any opportunity with representatives from those usual suspects and other more skeptical governments to help explain and hopefully depoliticize the program. Likewise, I do believe it is important to call out member states and hold them accountable for their actions, particularly when they do not match their rhetoric. This report is an important step in that direction. I thank you for being here today, and I take this opportunity to wish you all the very best in the battles ahead and success in supporting the United Nations' essential human rights work. Cheers.
Okay, thank you to Kyle. Before we get started with questions for the panel, just a quick introduction to who we have here. We have Anjali. Anjali Dutt is an independent researcher and the author of the report. She's been conducting research and advocacy on human rights related issues related to China and its impact globally for over a decade. We have Rafael Viana David, who is a program manager at ISHR and leads ISHR's work to support Chinese human rights defenders at the UN and is also part of ISHR's Latin America team. And we finally have Thibault Cameli, who is a research scholar on multilateral reform with the Center on International Cooperation at New York University. He brings over 15 years of experience in diplomacy, public finance, and international public policy, spanning both the public and private sectors. He held senior diplomatic positions representing both the EU and France to the UN in New York, where he focused on human rights, UN governance, and institutional reform. So to get started, my first question is for Anjali. Anjali, can you tell us a little bit about the methodology behind the research, an overview of your key findings, as well as, because we all need it, a basic overview of the UN human rights budget processes?
Thank you, Madeline, and thank all of you for coming here today. This report is based on 37 confidential interviews that I conducted between July of last year and to July of this year. 19 were with current or former Fifth Committee delegates from all 5 UN regional groups. I also spoke to 5 current and former UN officials, as well as other diplomats and experts. All interviewees were granted anonymity so they would be able to speak more freely. Though I did reach out to Russia, who declined to meet with us, and China did not respond to our meeting request. The desk research included reviewing UN budget documents, mainly covering the period 2019 to 2024. This included non-public Rev 1 draft resolutions. I also examined voting data for the past 20 years. The full methodology can be seen in detail in the report, just a little bit of background. So the key finding of this report is maybe not a surprise, but that the United States, China, and Russia have created an existential threat to the UN's human rights work through attacks on the UN budget. China and Russia and other authoritarian allies have weaponized and politicized the General Assembly's Fifth Committee budget process to try to defund ISHR and Human Rights Council mandated country investigations in order to shield themselves from accountability. While Russia and most of these countries are working in their self-interest to shield themselves or their friends from scrutiny, there has never been a Human Rights Council investigation into China. China is seeking to fundamentally change the UN system away from one that conducts investigations in countries, that examines civil and political rights, and that establishes mechanisms to hold human rights abusers accountable. We found that Russia has frequently played the role of what we call the loud spoiler, enabling China to operate more quietly but effectively behind closed doors as what we call the quiet obstructionist. China and Russia influence technical bodies, that we'll go into in more detail later, to have these supposedly independent officials recommend disproportionate cuts to human rights. They then obstruct the efforts by other states to push forward language favorable to human rights funding, and ultimately the disproportionate technical cuts to human rights they've influenced get adopted. The U.S. under the second Trump administration has made devastating cuts to the U.S.'s voluntary contributions to the UN and stopped paying its assessed contributions. I think everybody here knows. But the U.S. is responsible for 80% of the unpaid assessments in 2025, followed closely by China. These two countries are fueling an ongoing budget crisis, which has led to severe cuts to ISHR's work on the ground. The U.S. has grounded its criticism of the UN human rights system over a perceived anti-Israel bias. But in fact, we found that Israel had triggered more votes in the Fifth Committee than any other country in the past 20 years, in an ultimately unsuccessful effort to defund Human Rights Council investigations into its conduct in the occupied Palestinian territory, an effort that's been largely and almost exclusively backed by the United States. As the U.S. steps back from the UN, it is creating space for China and Russia to expand their influence and further advance their anti-human rights agenda through budget and administrative processes. Though last but not least, there has been several groups of states, especially WEOG and Latin American countries, that have exerted a lot of effort to push back on corrosive attempts to defund human rights. We acknowledge and thank these states for their efforts and hope that this report will shed light on this issue and help pressure more states to join the fight on behalf of human rights funding. So, this slide. So this is our very simplified explanation of how the budget works. There are two tracks to the UN's regular budget, the budget or resources track and the program plan track. The UN regular budget is made up of 36 sections paid by UN member states' assessed contributions. Since 2019, the UN has operated on an annual budget, and in the spring, the Secretary General releases the proposed program budget for the following year. Each section has a request for the budget or the resources and a program plan. Human rights is section 24. At the end of the year, the Secretary General also submits a revised estimate document with the budget for resolutions and decisions emanating from the 3 Human Rights Council sessions of that year, because 2 come after the time when the budget is first proposed. For the budget track, the Secretary General's reports first go to the Advisory Committee on Administrative and Budgetary Questions, the ACABQ. The ACABQ issues a report with recommendations on all 36 sections, as well as a report on the Human Rights Council revised estimates budget. These reports are the basis of the Fifth Committee negotiations, essentially adopting or rejecting those recommendations. As we can see from the program track, in parallel to the ACABQ review, a body called the Committee for Program and Coordination, or the CPC, reviews the program plans. The CPC, which is made up of member states, makes recommendations to the Fifth Committee on the programs. If it cannot find consensus, the program is referred to the main committee in the General Assembly related to the program. So for human rights, that is the third committee. Spoiler, we'll talk about this later, but the CPC cannot find consensus on the human rights program plan. Well, I guess Kyle would also already spoiled that. At the end of the Fifth Committee main session, which is usually around Christmas or New Year's if things have gone terribly wrong, the Fifth Committee sits to adopt the budget resolutions and the program plans. And while the Fifth Committee has a tradition of consensus, the last time the budget was adopted by consensus was in 2006. Once the Fifth Committee votes and adopts its resolutions, the budget then goes to the GA plenary the same day, and the GA plenary votes to formally adopt and approve the budget for the following year. And the vote is then normally on the same lines as the Fifth Committee.
Thank you, Anjali. Turning now to Raphael. So we've heard a lot about the so-called liquidity crisis facing the UN. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about how this crisis came about, how ISHR has had to adapt to it, and how this leaves it more vulnerable to the influence of those wishing to shape its agenda?
Thank you. It's so good to see everyone here. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that everyone's well fed up because it's a very heavy conversation, but we're really glad to be here. I really first want to really warmly thank Angeli for her outstanding work of research. It is, as you can appreciate, a humongous amount of work, and that's the result of this, but also to thank, of course, the Deputy Permanent Representative of France and also our dear friends Thibault to join us today in the conversation. So perhaps just to say that the genesis of this report a couple of years back actually was to look into what we had heard were long-term attacks into human rights and human rights council mandates in particular of countries that what we know now are led by China and Russia. And as we have developed this research, actually this research now, as I think you've rightfully said, arrives in a very particular moment of UN reform and of the liquidity crisis. So one really is that we're really looking at how those long-term attacks are compounded with basically the fact that the UN is running out of cash. So as Angeli briefly said, over the past years, the US and China have fueled a very strong liquidity crisis because they're simply paying late or not paying in full their UN dues. The US contributes to 22%, which is the maximum that a state can contribute to the regular budget, and China now contributes 20% from 15% last year. And I think importantly to note, it only paid 3% of the UN's regular budget 15 years ago. So it is a significant shift, of course, that comes with a degree of influence. Over the past years, China has been really paying its dues very late without a lot of foreseeability. So to give an example that I think a lot are familiar with, last year, the government paid its dues in full on 27 December. So we appreciate the impact of this 5 days before the end of the year. This means first that the UN doesn't have that cash until the end of the year, and second, that means that not all the cash can be spent by the 31st of December. Now, for those that are not familiar with this, under UN financial rules, all unspent cash is actually given back to all member states, which means that effectively states that are paying too late and that cash cannot be spent are not paying in full, which is the case of China in a range of other states. To give an example, this year, I think this was an update by the UN controller a few weeks back, the UN started with having to give back $89 million to member states just this year, and this is expected to rise next year. Now turning to the US, of course, it's been a country that has traditionally paid its contributions also very late, given the differences in its fiscal calendars, although with perhaps some more degree of foreseeability. And both the impact of those kind of like delayed payments by China and the US have led to real term budget cuts to the ISHR's budget of 13% and 27% in 2024 and the first half of 2025 respectively. This is data that you'll find in the report, but you'll appreciate this is almost a fourth, in the latter example, a fourth of the budget. Of course, 2025 has really accelerated this trend immensely. As we are familiar, first, before talking about the big elephant in the room, of course, as the last update, China has paid 72% of its dues, a little bit over 2/3 as of 30 September. It still owes closer to $100 million to the organization, which is still, of course, a lot of money. But as per the last update again of the UN Controller and Undersecretary General Catherine Pollard, 80% of the unpaid contributions, as Angeli said, come from the US. This is $1.5 billion out of the, I believe, $1.8 or $1.9 billion the UN is still due for this year. 10% come from China, 4% come from Russia, and other countries that are owing more than $10 million include Venezuela, Mexico, and Argentina. Another data that is important, as of 30 September, a couple others have trickled in since, 136 member states have paid, which is relatively low for the stage of the year and lower than other periods, that the same period a couple of years, over the last couple of years. And should also give a sense also of dimension. We're not talking that much money. I mean, we're talking much money for the UN. We're not talking that much money in terms of what states can contribute. The UN's regular budget is $3.7 billion. We did a rapid comparison. This is approximately the budget of the city of Lisbon in a year, or less than the budget. I think that's a familiar comparison here. That's less than the budget, way less than the budget of New York Police Department. So it is well within the capacity of states to be paying this. So what is perhaps also alarming from, I think, the update that was given was by the UN controller was that the UN running out of cash, has had to already tap into a couple of its cash flow reserves for the year. So we really don't know what's going to happen by December if there's simply no money to pay salaries or to cover other costs. Interestingly so, the US is just below right now with its arrears it's gonna be just below the 2-year threshold of Article 19 of the UN Charter. Article 19 sets that any state that accumulates arrears equivalent to 2 or more years of its last contributions loses its right of vote at the General Assembly. To put it very simply, next year there's 2 options. Either the US pays a certain amount of its dues, likely strategically to fall just below this 3-year threshold, or it risks losing voting rights of the G8 subsequently. I'm not gonna get too much into this. Oh, first, sorry, one more thing about this that is important is that the UN Secretariat has proposed solutions to this. Not solutions, a band-aid, let's say, but an important band-aid at the current moment. So one where they propose a suspension of the return of unspent cash during a liquidity crisis. That sounds obvious. That has not been endorsed, for instance, by the G77 plus China. And this is a recommendation that we also put in the report and that we fully endorse. In addition, of course, to this are all the voluntary contributions that are cut by the US. And to give an example, 60% of ISHR's budget comes from voluntary donations, the US being the single largest state donor, or a little bit below the EU if we take all EU member states together. Now, these are a lot of numbers. Actually, in our Annex 6 of the report, we did an analysis of the patterns of payments by states over the past 5 or 6 years, and you'll not be surprised to know that only 20 states pay usually within 30 days, the first month of the year, 86 by the end of June, and almost 60 never paid within the year. But to give you just a sense of impact, and I'll just close here, these are not just numbers, and this is also why I'm in ISHR's office in Geneva. This is why we fly here, to bring you the actual impact of what this means. I know that here you'll hear the numbers, you'll think that it's a couple of P3, P4, P5 positions. These positions are this budget matters. To give you one example, in Geneva, the mechanism that it was created in December to investigate rights abuses in the Democratic Republic of the Congo has just not been running because it just simply does not have cash. The treaty bodies, the committees that are assessing how states are implementing, are living up to the commitments that they have done, legal commitments under the treaties they ratified, are meeting less in Geneva, meaning they can review states less. To give you an example, the Committee Against Torture now is sitting on, I think, over 50 outstanding country reports, including China's, which means 50 countries' situation with regards to prohibition of torture is not getting reviewed by these committees. And there's a lot of other examples that I hope we can address through the interventions, but here there's not a million solutions. There's, of course, this important band-aid yet important recommendation of not sending unspent cash back to member states, but there needs to be a concerted effort to push states to pay their membership, their UN contributions, in full and on time.
Thank you, Raf, maybe in particular for bringing the realities from Geneva, but how all of these cuts are affecting the work of ISHR on the ground. Next question is coming back to Angeli and the budgeting process. Could you share a little bit about the role of the ACABQ and what particular influence it has over the budget?
Thanks. So we've already talked a bit about it, but the ACABQ is an extremely influential body. It's the main advisor to the Fifth Committee on all budget matters and reviews all budget proposals and revised estimates. Under UN rules, it's meant to be an independent body of 21 members. 3 are meant to be recognized financial experts. In reality, most are all former Fifth Committee diplomats who essentially go straight from negotiating for their state to sitting on the ACABQ as so-called independent experts. Among interviewees of this report, there was deep concern that ACABQ members are acting on behalf of their state, especially the ACABQ members from China and Russia. I also spoke to a former ACABQ member who confirmed that some states seem to be acting on instruction from capital and that many members are not favorable to human rights. The ACABQ has no code of conduct, code of ethics, or public working method. Fifth Committee delegates are not allowed to ask them why they reached their conclusions and recommendations. Not officially. As mentioned before, the entire budget negotiated by the Fifth Committee is essentially on the basis of these ACABQ reports. But the ACABQ has shown a deep hostility to human rights funding. So We examined the percentage cuts recommended to human rights by the ACABQ as compared to the development pillar and to the entire UN regular budget over a 5-year period. So this graph shows that percentage-wise, the ACABQ will recommend cuts of around 0.5% to development. It has a budget 3 times the size of human rights. So while 2 or 3% doesn't seem like that much per year, it's clearly disproportionate to how other pillars are being, cuts are recommended. In the 2024 budget, 22% of all the cuts the ACABQ recommended to the UN regular budget were to the tiny human rights budget. It was 15% in 2023. And you can see this is extremely disproportionate targeting of the human rights pillar. This broadly reflects the actions of China, Russia, and other states hostile to human rights who sit on the ACABQ. The ACABQ wields enormous influence over the budget, and these proposed cuts are normally always adopted. Maybe there's pushback and one post the ACABQ didn't recommend will be adopted. The Fifth Committee will reject that. But really, a lot of these cuts are coming through and have a real and ongoing impact on ISHR's ability to fulfill its mandate. We also found other evidence, which is detailed in the report, that the ACABQ members from China and Russia appear to be either working together on their own to block methodological changes to improve the budget process for funding the Human Rights Council, to try and interfere in other technical areas like the Board of Auditors, which I'll talk about later, and to block ISHR from hiring staff by consistently recommending temporary staff or short-term contracts so they can't bring people to Geneva. Really, China and Russia have weaponized this body, the ACABQ, to enact a death by 1,000 cuts to ISHR. So we have many recommendations in the report, but just to focus on a couple, we're calling for member states to take action to reform the ACABQ, to prevent conflicts of interest and to ensure its independence. This includes introducing a code of conduct, a code of ethics, and rules establishing a cooling off period of time during which diplomats cannot become members of subsidiary bodies. ISHR is also conducting a campaign around the elections this November for ACABQ membership, so if anyone is interested, we can talk more about that in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Angelique. Okay, now we're going to come to Thibault, who's been sitting patiently listening, and we're very interested in his thoughts in particular. So we've heard a lot so far, the liquidity crisis, the influence on the ACABQ. We'd love to hear what you think from your perspective and your experience of working on the C5, what recommendations you would prioritize for reform.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madeline, and good afternoon, everyone. Allow me, before answering your question, to congratulate me actually for the report. It's definitely something I wish I had when I was a Fifth Committee delegate, and I'm sure most of the Fifth Committee colleagues that I see here will appreciate the level of depth you've been going into to really not only understand the process, but really explain how political it can be and where member states can really intervene at the different stages of the process. And to address your question, maybe I should mention for transparency purposes that I'm a Fifth Committee veteran, also known as a Fifth Committee nerd. And definitely, there's definitely some Stockholm syndrome in all this, and I'm sure the Fifth Committee colleague will agree to that. But I would like here to provide maybe a little different perspective from what we've heard so far, and try and debunk 2 myths about the Fifth Committee, and that will actually be my way of addressing your question of perspective and experience. The first myth, and it's actually quite interesting that Angelique started presenting the Fifth Committee this way, is that the Fifth Committee is an administrative procedural committee. There is a reason why the Fifth Committee is one of the main committees of the General Assembly. It is inherently political, and it's political not so much by the tools or resources that it works on. These are the means to an end, and the end is the implementation of mandates. So essentially the way to see it, or the way I would summarize it to someone who doesn't know anything about the UN, let alone the Fifth Committee, is to say in the UN you have bodies that decide on mandates, and you have the Fifth Committee that makes sure those mandates are actually implemented. And that's a very different perspective. So most of the diplomats and colleagues that you will talk about will concentrate on mandate adoption, whereas the fifth committee has this almost unique perspective on looking into how those mandates are resourced with money and people so that they can actually be implemented and make a difference on the ground. And then from that experience, we can build budget and experience and efficiency measures, and that should feel into the loop, except we're only seeing that kind of level of involvement into the whole life cycle of mandates only recently. For the longest time, the only interest that most delegates of the UN had were about adopting mandates and not so much caring how those mandates were implemented. So it's a bit of revenge of the fifth committee in a way, what's happening these days. I don't want to be polemical here, but essentially understanding that is also a key to understanding why certain member states that have already realized that are actually using their role in the fifth committee to make sure that the mandates they do not care about are hindered, cannot be fully implemented, do not get the resources to actually be conducted. And that's very much what Anjali is describing. The tools at their disposal are multiple. The subsidiary organs are one of them, ACABQ and CPC. Their role in the fifth committee and within the negotiations is another one. But essentially, it comes and stems from their understanding that the fifth committee is key for the implementation of mandates. And by intervening in this committee that most people see as obscure, they're able to actually get what they cannot get in the legislative bodies in which those mandates are adopted. That was the first meeting I wanted to develop. The second general thinking that you hear is the fact that the budget rules are the same for every department, so why would ISHR and human rights be impacted more? I cannot make it fun, I'm sorry, but I will try to make it simple. And I will take for that three really archetypical examples, or reasons why I think you guys need to understand that the budget rules may be the same, but they do not impact the departments the same. The first element of that is the nature of the underlying operations. And for you to understand it, I would like you to imagine two different departments at the UN. One that has a normative role, that is HQ center, essentially turned around transversal support to some, say for example, statisticians to statistics forums. So essentially a HQ-centered support cross-cutting transversal body. And another body, another department within the UN that is field-based. The organization of which is decentralized, scattered around the different mandates with teams dedicated to each mandate on the ground, implementing or conducting those actions. Of course, this is the reality of the UN. So you can find very centralized HQ departments and very operational departments. Now, if you conduct a 15% cut on travel and you apply it across the board, across the different departments, what will be the concrete impact? The concrete impact on a central department that does statistics means that the statisticians will not be able to attend conferences around the world. They will still be able to mutualize and conduct their support to the different bodies that they help with. A field-based, operationally driven department that undergoes a 15% cut cannot conduct its mandates. It's impaired from doing its work being fact-checking, or the examples that Raphael was highlighting. So the nature of the cut is the same, but the nature of the departments being so different operationally means that the impact is widely different. The second example to debunk that myth of budget being the same is the issue around the stability of the UN budget. As some of you may know, there's a principle that is called the zero net growth, which means that if there's no new mandate, a department within the UN should not have an increase in its budget. Makes sense. Why would you require more money to conduct essentially the same level of mandates or obligations that are being given by the member states? And vice versa, if you have new mandates, then you should be able to come to the General Assembly and ask for adequate funding to actually cover those new activities. Unfortunately for OHCHR, what happened, and that has sedimented over time, is essentially an accumulation. So in 2016, OHCHR started implementing a regional reorganization, which was validated by the General Assembly, except when it came to implementation, it was decided that OHCHR could absorb it. So instead of having additional resources to reorganize and conduct better its regional functions, OHCHR was had to absorb it essentially, and so redirect resources from its core functions into these regional this regional functioning, essentially reducing what was already a low level of centralized resources to provide support to the different mechanisms that are within OHCHR towards its regional organization. So essentially, OHCHR, and you will have guessed with my first example, is the archetypical example of this very mandate-driven, regionally scattered organization. Having little centralized capacity to support mandates across the field or across the different functions that they have, OHCHR is often criticized for not being able to mutualize or have scaling up, have economies of scales and being able to support the same type of mandates. And the HRC does adopt some mandates that look the same, and so you could imagine that OHCHR will be able to support them, except OHCHR doesn't have the financial or organizational capacity to do that support cross-cutting. And that's one of the main reproaches that the ACABQ comes up every time OHCHR requests new resources. ACABQ applies a rather transversal cross-cutting grid of analysis, except it does not apply to OHCHR. And year after year, the ACABQ recommends building up the support functions, the platform on which more could be absorbed for the different new mandates that are being created, but the General Assembly doesn't follow through, and those resources are not allocated. So OHCHR is essentially quartered in between a request to implement the mandate which requires scattering around the resources, and a request by ACABQ, sometimes pushed by some other member states, to build up centralized capacity and absorb more at a central level. That's a conundrum that nobody has a solution for except putting more money for OHCHR to build up this centralized capacity. The third aspect is the level of scrutiny that OHCHR falls under. And we've heard it several times. Kyle spoke about the fact that he had the pleasure and joy to have multiple interactions a year with the ACABQ. That comes from a specificity, yet another one, of OHCHR when presenting its budget needs. Most departments within the UN only come to the General Assembly only once, and that's once within the regular budget, so with all the other departments of the United Nations. As far as OHCHR is concerned, we need to come up with another acronym. As far as OHCHR is concerned, the nature of how those mandates are created and adopted makes it impossible for the office to come just one time with the certainty of how much money they will need to implement the mandates. And that comes from the fact that up until late November, sometimes beginning of December, the Human Rights Council does adopt mandates or renews mandates. As long as those mandates have not been formally renewed or adopted by the HRC, the General Assembly cannot consider those resources, and that means a significant part of the budget for human rights is discussed separately from the regular budget. Of course, that means two things essentially. One, you have twice the level of scrutiny by the ACABQ and the General Assembly. Once in the regular budget with the rest of the budget of the UN, and the second time specifically on those mandates from the HRC. The second thing that it means is that there's less possibility, except for the creativity of the Fifth Committee delegates, there's less possibility of having a platform to really discuss everything together. There's almost a silo negotiations for those two aspects. That partly comes with the fact that the HRC additional resources that are presented in a report that is called Revised Estimates. This report comes to the Fifth Committee very late in December. And that means pushing the deadline of the negotiations quite often. So to sum up, yes, the budget rules are the same, but they do not hit ISHR identically. And these are both for political and technical operational reasons or elements. Now, the silver lining is that there's been an understanding by the member states and ISHR of that reality, and over the past couple of years, there were attempts to improve that situation, partly by putting up front some of the resources of the HRC mandates that were predictably going to be renewed, or by trying to develop some of those pooling capacities that I was talking about, and trying to reorganize the regional expansion of ISHR. Now, I haven't forgotten your question, Madeleine, on the recommendations, and I'll be quicker on those. But I really wanted to debunk those two myths because they are essentially what people do not understand when it comes to the reality of what Fifth Committee does when it comes to human rights. So if you talk to your colleagues in Geneva, please tell them that yes, the Fifth Committee delegates do have at heart to defend the human rights. It's very complicated to do so for those reasons. Now, recommendations, I'll have 3 of them. The first one is an effort of pedagogy, and that's what we're doing today. We need to explain, we need to continue raising awareness of those specificities of the situation of ISHR, and that includes ISHR itself. There's almost a sense by some member states, and I confess it was my sense when I was a delegate in the First Committee, that ISHR in Geneva does not really get the dynamics of negotiating the budget. The report will be a huge help for that. There are so many elements that the Fifth Committee delegates have been calling for, elements of justification, elements of tangible illustration of those difficulties that I hope the Fifth Committee delegates will pick up and bring forward in the negotiations. The second recommendation is one of building ISHR resilience. And that comes with, I think, 2 things. The first one would be an effort within the HRC to streamline mandates and not waterboard ISHR with so many new mandates that it has to scatter its resources. The second one, and that's one of the silver lining of UNHCR, but we'll come to that later, is the follow-up and implementation and not just the adoption. And that requires discipline, I think, both from New York and from Geneva, but also, and more importantly, consistency, as I think Angelini were calling for. As we see so many countries adopting a position in the HRC and having sometimes a completely opposite position when it comes to funding the same mandate they adopted in Geneva. We need to hold those member states accountable, at least for the consistency of it. The third aspect that I wanted to highlight, and that will be actually linked to what you were describing, Raphael, is the best way to support the implementation of human rights mandates is to support a solution to the liquidity crisis of the UN. As long as the UN is forced into liquidity shortages, as we see, the first mandates that are implemented are the ones that require more people, recruitment of more people to implement mandates. No cash means vacancies, means no implementation of mandates. And I will conclude this.
Thank you so much. That was very rich. There are a lot of takeaways from that, and your UN nerdiness is very welcomed in all respects here. Safe space for UN and C5 in particular nerds. turning back to Raphael, the report outlines several ways, obviously, that states are exerting their influence. Can you share with us a little bit about how states are using the negotiations, in particular, the votes in the C5 to try to defund mandates?
Thank you so much, and again, yeah, thank you so much, Thibault, for these comments. I think the one that I agree the most with you is that we have to change the acronyms, and I'll put ACABQ in there too, if I may. Perhaps just the context on this discussion on defunding of specifically Human Rights Council mandates. So with, as Kyle said, kind of like a lot of the hostility to human rights is carried out through the Fifth Committee, and we really have to understand this part as a complement tactically or strategically with what Angeli was describing as influence over the ACABQ precisely to propose cuts to human rights. And when we looked at the negotiations and at the votes of the Fifth Committee, what we found is that two tactics are that during the negotiation, we have a lot of extreme proposals to defund Human Rights Council mandates that are tabled, and then some of them are kind of like forced through votes at the Fifth Committee itself. And again, I think this really goes against, as we were just hearing kind of like from Thibault, the spirit of the Fifth Committee, which is to be looking at how we implement mandates and not to be weaponized in that space to contest that mandate that has been created elsewhere, and in this case in Geneva, often by the same states. So the targets here were two really. First, kind of like an attempt through these proposals and votes to really cripple the ISHR's budget, in particular in civil and political rights, on human rights defenders in civil society space and non-discrimination, particularly those areas, and to defund specific Human Rights Council created commissions of inquiry or others that are looking at a range of countries. Now here, of course, the role of regional and political groups is really important, and the report outlines that. Because as the formal negotiations, of course, take place at the Fifth Committee, a lot of it also happens and is discussed among those groups. One of them that is very important, as you will be familiar with, is the G77 plus China. As Russia may negotiate separately, at least for the program budget, the G77 negotiates as a group, and every single delegate that we spoke to, nearly every single delegate that we spoke to actually singled out China as the most hostile to human rights, in particular within the G77 plus China. Using usually arguments of seeking efficiencies or to support or prioritize funding for the development pillar. A little bit with what we were saying at the very beginning of the opening remarks, in this idea that one has to be held in competition with the other. Want to highlight one point that Angeli said before, which is really the important role that Latin American states have been playing, exerting enormous effort, and I think bearing a huge political and diplomatic cost in trying to oppose those cuts when discussed within the G77. Again, basically, it's a pretty much, I don't know how we say this in English, but in French we say une guerre des tranchées. It really sounds like, on one hand, you have China single-handedly pushing those cuts at the G77, and on the other hand, a range of Latin American democracies. And what I think is really startling is that in the middle, from all the discussions that we've had, we never had, maybe with one exception, no African or Asia Pacific state that has ever stood up to support Latin Americans. I think it might have. Thankfully, I speak loudly, so I think it's fine. So yeah, basically we've not had any African or Asia Pacific state that has really stood up with the Latin Americans in this sense. And there's really been a pretty concern for us, in particular because they've defended those mandates in Geneva, but we'll get to this. And so we've had a couple of those proposals. I mean, we have them in the report, but a lot of them, in particular on our Annex 5, that is really long, that talks about all those proposals in detail. But a lot of them are simply, defund completely X investigation, or abolish all posts for ISHR that are vacant for 2 years, or reduce activities by 50%. These are massive and very extreme proposals. We see a lot of those proposals also on the HRC resolutions, and here it is really not just China, it is really a group of countries that is led by China and Russia that are really targeting specific Human Rights Council investigations. So we also try to quantify this, and to give you an example, we've seen at least 25 attempts to defund mechanisms related to Belarus. That's the largest. Yeah, we have them there. Forgot to skip those, but they're all in the report and they're great graphs, and we work hard on those, so please look at them. We've had, for instance, 17 on Iran, 15 on Russia, in particular with regards to Georgia or to Ukraine, 14 on Syria, etc., etc. we'll see that a lot of the states, of course, when they're proposing making those proposals, they're acting in their self-interest, their collective self-interest, because it's also about shielding their friends from scrutiny. With the exception of China, because as Angeli said, China has managed to wield so much influence in the UN that it has prevented the establishment of an investigation into its atrocity crimes, despite a UN report saying that those crimes were likely committed. One point is that I think both those states are acting in their self-interest, but also promoting a vision of the UN system away from accountability and scrutiny for human rights abuses, and one where national sovereignty primes over human rights. And this is the view of a group that you're very familiar with, which is the UN Group of Friends, the Group of Friends of the UN Charter, which now also exists in Geneva, and coordinates very strongly also in Geneva. And basically, this is a pretty interesting scenario, because basically we have a group of countries investigated, the same group of countries proposing to eliminate funding during negotiations, and I'll get to voting, the same countries that are triggering votes on those same exact resolutions. So it's a pretty much of a circle in this sense. And the second stage that we looked at after the negotiations was precisely the votes that I think were here. And so we've looked at votes over the longer period. And so, as we were saying again, consensus should be in the spirit and the DNA a little bit of the Fifth Committee. Well, the votes don't want to appear, but they're going to be there on the screen very soon. And what we've seen is that those votes basically break that spirit. And we've done a little calculation over the past 20 years. We've had, I think it was 87 votes at the Fifth Committee that were called, with the most called last year in 2024. And it's been then, therefore, extremely common, in particular over the past 4 or 5 years. The country that has triggered the biggest amount of votes has been Israel, always on attempts to defund all Human Rights Council investigations into Palestine that are, you will appreciate, extremely important in the current context. And they're followed by Russia, who calls votes on behalf of the same group of countries with China to defend always a cluster of HRC resolutions that were adopted in Geneva. We've also seen instances where countries have alone called votes on their own investigations. So, for instance, Sudan or Ethiopia. I'm not going to get too much into this, but just to say we have also an excellent annex in the report, Annex 7, that analyzes the voting patterns, exactly what Thibault was saying, the voting patterns at the Fifth Committee, because we thought this is something that didn't get a lot of visibility. And just briefly looking at voting patterns across those different targeted resolutions over the past, I think, 5 or 6 years, we found that only 14 states have overwhelmingly voted to defund Human Rights Council investigations. So again, the same ones that are investigated, the same ones that table the proposals, the same ones that trigger the votes, and the same ones that are in the UN Group of Friends of the UN Charter. Very worryingly, 5 of them have been or are Human Rights Council members, and these are China, Cuba, Bolivia, Eritrea, and Sudan, which of course this is an unfit behavior for Human Rights Council membership. Well, of course, an important bloc of around 60 Western, Eastern European, Latin American states, plus Japan, South Korea, and Turkey have been overwhelmingly opposing defunding. We do want to note that only 36 of those have done this consistently, as a lot of other states have been carving out exceptions when it comes to votes on defunding investigations on Palestine, which again doesn't speak to the speaks to the importance of consistency. The vast majority of African and Asia Pacific states overwhelmingly abstain, perhaps with an exception of half of the African group that has voted at least once to defund investigations on an African country, again in this case Sudan or Ethiopia. And I think importantly also is that despite those abstentions, we identified at least 19 current or former Human Rights Council members who voted in favor of a resolution at the Human Rights Council. And that same resolution, when it was targeted by this group attack by China and Russia in this group of targeted resolutions, failed to support its funding, or I should say, did not oppose the defunding. Basically, I vote in Geneva in favor of the creation of this mechanism, most often on Ukraine, on Iran, on Syria, and I do not oppose its defunding at the Fifth Committee. And this is a very blatant lack of consistency, and this leads me actually to, this was of course a point that Thibault just raised, and this leads me to 2 recommendations on this part, which is first the importance of consistency in voting across Geneva and New York. as well as, again, a greater support, I think, for those global majority countries, Latin American, also in other regions that are, supporting efforts to fund human rights and opposing efforts to defund human rights. These are extremely important in the current context. I cannot, I think, highlight how difficult, of course, those conversations are, and I'm sure you'll appreciate them too. And we need kind of like a much more concerted and stronger effort in this sense.
Yeah, no, it's right. Yeah, you just talk like right into it. You have to be like very, very close. Thank you, Raf, and thank you for that call to action. Coming back to Anjali now, you gave us a little preview when you were speaking about the ACABQ earlier that there were some other bodies, little known bodies that also have enormous influence. So can you tell us a little bit in particular about the CPC and the Board of Auditors, the BOA, and how their role and influence impacts?
So yeah, starting with the CPC, there's many fun charts in the report, but has been really crippled by obstruction by certain actors in the past few years, particularly Russia, but followed as well by China, Iran, and Cuba. So I forgot to mention this in the methodology, but I also looked at 5 years of CDOCs, which are the draft CPC reports, which is where we're able to see really which state is proposing and or objecting to certain kinds of language. And within the CPC, Kyle also mentioned this, but I guess I looked a little further back, but the CPC has only been able to adopt a program on human rights 5 times in the past 30 years. The last time was in 2016. Often, these states that are hostile, they are objecting to language used in the plan. This is usually human rights terminology that's widely used across UN bodies, as you can see from the screenshot. In a really misguided attempt, in 2021, the UN Secretariat tried to adopt a glossary to censor certain words from program plans. Words like women's rights or human rights norms and standards. I wish I was joking, but I'm not. A copy of the glossary is in the annex of the report. And as you can tell, the annex is pretty exciting. So one egregious example from this glossary is the Secretariat proposed to exclude the phrase a rights-based approach in program plans and instead replace it with a Chinese political phrase, people-centered approach. This is highly problematic for many reasons. The most prominent being that a people-centered approach means a state-centered approach. It's basically the opposite of a rights-based approach. China has also invested heavily in diplomatic efforts, particularly in Geneva, as Raf knows, to try and push this concept and remove the concept of a human rights-based approach to development. So we did get confirmation that the glossary was never adopted, but that there is some self-censorship that persists in program plans. And while we reach back to the beginning of the event, when I talked about the program plan track, why there has been this workaround where the CPC, when it cannot adopt a human rights program, refers it instead to the third committee. This workaround to obstruct, to bypass the obstruction hasn't resulted in a program plan for OHCHR. OHCHR hasn't had one for nearly a decade. And this lack of a program plan really feeds into this narrative advanced by China and Russia and others in the ACBQ committee that OHCHR doesn't need the resources that they request. So the CPC really does have this other role in kind of, obstructing these budget requests. So as Madeline mentioned, the Board of Auditors is another body that we'll talk about briefly. It's made up of 3 national level auditors, though they are expected to act independently of their state. And there is a written code of conduct and code of ethics, which we always like to see. Currently, the board is made up of auditors from China, France, and Brazil. So ISHR, we learned during the process of this research that China's board member and the ACABQ member from China both tried to pressure internally for China to take over auditing OHCHR from France. We have traditionally audited OHCHR. We also learned that China's Board of Auditors member had asked for the names of every UN whistleblower and the CVs of every Chinese national that works for the UN. And while the UN Secretariat refused to provide that information, obviously we were quite worried that China or another authoritarian ally may seek a seat at the Board of Auditors to weaponize this body to obtain confidential information about human rights defenders or other individuals working with ISHR. China is one of the worst perpetrators of reprisals. And while the UN Secretariat told us that they would not provide confidential information on human rights defenders during audits, no one would actually know if their information had been handed over. So these technical bodies, CPC and the BOA, Board of Auditors, show how these actors like China are really seeking to harm the UN human rights system through these different avenues. We always have a lot of recommendations, but for member states that do take a principled approach to human rights, we do want to see more investment in the CPC to really help push back and support those who have been doing that work already on these obstructive efforts. And we also need transparency and attention on these sort of actions, like what's happened at the Board of Auditors.
Thank you, Angelique, for that chilling bit of information. We're now going to move to UN 80. I have one more question for Raphael and one for Thibault, and then please, if you have questions on your mind, start thinking about them for our panel. So we've all heard of UN 80, obviously, the SG's initiative to transform how the UN works, identifying efficiencies, reviewing how mandates are implemented, and examining potential structural reforms. In September, the SG shared a revised 2026 budget, obviously you're all aware, outlining more than $500 million in cuts, while also introducing the first measures of the UN 80 initiative. Raf, can you tell us a little bit about how these cuts are poised to affect the budget for human rights in particular, and what recommendations you have for ensuring that UN human rights work is not disproportionately targeted?
Sure, thank you so much, and thanks again for kind of like following us up to here. Now we're really kind of like, having a little bit of a looking forward. Looking for a moment. I hope that's not a metaphor of what's going to happen to this organization. Everybody's familiar with UN 80. One of the reasons also why we come here, as I said also for another intervention, is this is not just a New York process, and I really hope that this is something that is also here very clearly. It is also a Geneva process, and there's a lack of understanding, and there's a lack of clarity as to how the process is going. But insofar as it comes to human rights, and we've seen the really important role of ISHR and the Human Rights Council, this cannot be a process in which Geneva is, downgraded to kind of like an observer status somehow. So having said this, kind of like just as a general note on UN 80, I mean, we're all familiar with the different streams of work of UN 80. One kind of like overarching concern that we have is that UN 80, of course, responds to immediate, cost-saving needs related to a belated financial crisis. It also responds to, legitimate and long-term needs for reform of the organization. But the former is taking a little bit over the latter on our perspective, and really this perspective and this framing around cost-saving is really what is shaping discussions about what should be longer discussions, strategic discussions on how to review mandates to make them more effective and not just to cut costs for the sake of it. Of course, and the last thing is that this is happening on top of all the different patterns of attacks on human rights budget that we've seen, and this is really taking them to kind of like another dimension at some point. Under work stream 1, and I'm not going to much talk about the others, just noting that of course a lot of it is also dependent on what are the reform proposals next year that are probably going to be discussed for the budget of the year after. But we're now faced with, as you're familiar, with the proposed cuts by the Secretary General under work stream 1. We should of course note that again, this is a work stream that just looks at cost saving. Those savings do not respond to strategic objectives. So we've failed, in particular in the revised estimates report, to see to what extent cutting 15% here or there to the ISHR advances any objective of the ISHR. ISHR looked at a little bit in detail at the revised estimates report that the Secretary General issued a couple of weeks back, and as you're familiar, the Secretary General has announced 15% cut across the organization and has announced quote-unquote calibrated cuts that would affect human rights pillars equally. And I think that's something that Thibault has already addressed in terms of that actually, even if the number is the same, that doesn't affect them the same. The problem is that the number is not even the same. We've looked at different sections of the budget, and with a rapid calculation, a little bit below 13% of cuts, or 12.7% of cuts, I think, to, 11.7% of cuts to the development pillar, and around 13% on business security, as we could see. And again, this is not equitable because we're talking about a pillar, human rights, that has been historically underfunded at 5 to 7% of the UN's regular budget. Now we know these proposals are in the hands of the ACABQ, and if, and I hope I'm wrong, we follow the logic of how the ACABQ has engaged on this over the past couple of years, these 15% of cuts might be the best case scenario, and we hope that they're not. Again, to come back to, these are not just numbers and stats. 1% of the OICHR's budget is around $2.6 million, and we looked exactly at what could be done. If you look at, for instance, the guidance on PBIs, on budget implications, 1% of the OICHR budget could fund a full country investigation, such as the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine or the fact-finding mission of Venezuela. 1% of OICHR budget funds the mandate of 5 special rapporteurs in 1 year, funds over 20 visits by special rapporteurs, visits to countries that often lead to changes in policies, to changes in problematic laws, and to protection for at-risk individuals. 20 of those are disappearing, basically, for every 1% of cut that the OICHR is facing. 1% of cut, and 1%, for instance, in the development pillar is 3%, nearly 3% of the OICHR's budget. So, I think this is just to give a sense of kind of like the proportions here. To give one last example of impact, and which is the International Independent Mechanism on Myanmar, the one that is basically tasked with collecting evidence of atrocity crimes and preparing and sharing those evidence with the ICC or other jurisdictions. This is, as you know, a budget that sits outside of the human rights one in the budget of the UN, but that has been equally targeted by 15 to 16%. I think Syria mechanism even more. We asked the independent mechanism on Myanmar, how does the liquidity crisis compounded with the budget cuts affect their ability to implement their mandate concretely? Not just, oh, we'll travel less, we'll have less staff. And they've told us that next year, also on top of the voluntary donations to them that were cut, they are looking at likely cutting their unit that investigates sexual and gender-based violence in a conflict like Myanmar. They also are looking at cutting their unit on open source investigation, which is, as you'll appreciate, extremely grave in a situation where you don't have access to the country. So now what's next? What's next, of course, I think we're all patiently waiting for the ACBQ to submit its report on the rise estimates. If you already have it, we're accepted very discreetly at the end of this event. But again, this means that this 15% scenario is one of the best case scenarios. And I think the idea of talking about UNAID at the end of this is, again, that we all collectively understand the sense of urgency that we're facing. If we're already starting with cuts on human rights under the Stream 1, we start with a terrible ground to negotiate reform for next year, even if it's legitimate reform. And we really, I think the recommendation here is it's very clear, it's simple somehow. Understanding the gravity, understanding kind of like the financial precipice that we're facing on the human rights field, and how that really affects the human rights budget and the ability to conduct investigations, protect individuals at risk. And during this UNAID exercise, ensuring that it's not just a cost-saving exercise. We're living definitely in an exceptional, I think, moment of reform. It's important that we have the same degree of exceptional measures that are taken, and this means taking concerted action to prevent during FACSI negotiations that human rights are disproportionately cut. And there's a lot of other opportunities here, and I really want to speak as my last point to the importance of concerted action. The UN exists not only because great powers sat down and thought we're going to create this organization, but also because a lot of small and mid-sized countries need it for their survival in this very hostile planet. And so there is a very large majority of countries that have an interest, despite their differences, in having the UN as a strong and well-funded organization. And it's important that these countries start acting together, including on human rights. A good initiative, for instance, in Geneva, Chile, I think it's Chile, the Netherlands, Kyrgyzstan, and Albania, deliver a joint statement on the importance of multilateralism, and this is a very good effort at coalescing states. I think it was nearly 50 or 60 states. We hope this is something that can also be brought back to New York. And a very important point that was raised by Francis DPR is the importance that civil society is fully, adequately included and meaningfully consulted in this process, because ultimately on human rights, that affects us.
Okay, last question for Tito. Your perspectives on UN 80, any recommendations you have in particular to see the impacts on human rights minimized?
Thank you, Madeline. It's difficult to speak after Raphael because you made such a compelling case. I guess the first difficulty I point out, and that's probably something that all of you who have dared look into the UN80 papers will have realized, that it's actually process-driven, not pillar-driven. So it's very difficult to get a sense of what's happening for a particular policy or for a particular pillar in general, because the information is spread across different reports that have each of them a separate process, different streams of where they're discussed and negotiated in the organization. So to be able to assess the situation and strategize about it is the first major difficulty. What I can analyze from the different papers that have been out, and now we have reports on all three work streams of the UN80 initiative, is unlike peace and security and development, there's no real major institutional redesign that is anticipated or programmed when it comes to human rights. There's no real consideration for an expansion of capacity. Reduction of capacity, probably, and that's one of the risks that Jay, you were pointing out a bit earlier, that when we consider, for example, mergers of different agencies, funds, and programs, we need to make sure that merging does not mean deletion of some of those mandates that these agencies, funds, and programs have. It still isn't clear at this stage, also because the structural reform process has an early presentation, but it's important to, I would say, put your foot down, essentially, as member states, and really defend the mandates that are important to all of us. We obviously insist quite a lot about what's very concrete and present and in front of us, and that's Fifth Committee negotiation on Work Stream 1 and the budget reductions that are going ahead. I have a little different perspective, Raphael, if you'll allow me, and not that I want to be controversial, but maybe present things a little differently. I don't necessarily think that the research of efficiency and cuts is a bad thing. It's only normal for an organization like the UN to essentially mimic or reflect the reality of the member states. And what we've been seeing for at least 4 years now is a steep decrease in the overall funding of the organization, materially through a very steep decrease of voluntary funding to the organization and the different funds and programs. That's a reality, and that's the actual reality that is the background and that underpins the efforts of the Secretary General to still make the organization relevant with less money. So reorganizing the UN and finding all those efficiencies is not so much to solve the financial crisis that the UN is witnessing today, even though it is one of the background elements, but really reflecting the reality that the member states are funding the UN less. And so the UN still needs to go forward and still be relevant. So efficiencies, yes, absolutely. They're necessary, and they're actually, I would say they're an act of political courage by the Secretary General to really, in the last year and a half of his mandate, to really show that he is still the officer of this organization and really try and make it relevant. The way it is implemented, however, and that's where I would join you, Raphael, I should say in French. Where I would join you is in how it impacts, again, ISHR differently. So you pointed out 50% cuts, and you computed how much that would make for the development pillar. Of course, the basis was so different that comparing percentages doesn't really account for the difference. I think the most obvious or speaking illustration would be that there's only one set of ring fence of exceptions in the cuts that are proposed in the revised estimates. And no surprise, not on human rights. These exceptions are for the development pillar. They're for the development account, they're for the regular program for technical cooperation, and they're for the Africa account. These are the member states facing aspects of the development pillar that are within the regular budget. These exceptions, these ring fencing, make sense. They're an answer to a constant request by member states, by very vocal member states from the Global South. And it's only legitimate that the Secretary General takes them into account because they've been voiced so loudly and so importantly, and they are important aspects of the policy. What it means, though, in terms of balance between the pillars, is that essentially when it comes to the development pillar, the only sections of the budget that do have cuts, that do have reductions of their operational expenditures, are the structural ones that are essentially DESA and the regional economic commissions. Now it's interesting that finally these elements of the budget, that these elements of organizations are called to reorganize and reduce their budgets. Those of you who have negotiated the implementation of the reorganized resident coordinator system will remember that in 2017, when this was adopted, there was a request by the General Assembly that DESA reorganize its structure, and not only its internal structure as a department and headquarters, but also its interaction with the regional and economic commissions. DESA always pushed back against that particular request and eventually never implemented it, arguing that its organization was mimicking the implementation and the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so as long as the SDGs were not implemented, DESA would not reorganize. But essentially, we're seeing with UN80 today what should have happened almost 10 years ago now. Whereas what we're seeing for ISHR is yet another level of cuts that is not putting DESA and ISHR or the development pillar and the human rights pillar on equal footing. And that's only for the cuts. The other aspect of workstream 1 is the abolition of posts. And on here again, a specificity that I think is important highlighting for ISHR. If I read the reports correctly, and I'm very much in the hands of the Details Committee experts here that have probably read it much more than I have, but I noted 105 proposed abolitions for ISHR. And what the Secretary General presents as calibrated cuts or calibrated reductions is essentially the consideration of the vacant posts. So to make it less hurtful across the different programs, the posts that are proposed for abolition are the ones that are not occupied, that are vacant. It makes sense. It's not hurting the people, or trying to not hurt the people that have a job within the UN. But as we know, ISHR being mandate-driven has been unable to recruit people to implement its mandates because of the liquidity crisis. The liquidity crisis has created the vacancy issue with ISHR. And so ISHR is not giving away posts that it didn't need and didn't fill. It's giving away posts that it needed, that were created because of mandates, but were not filled because of the liquidity situation. So overall, my fear is that UN80 is somehow undoing years of effort since 2021 for refilling the budget and the positions of ISHR. And it's also, and more importantly, rolling back the change of mindsets that we finally were able to achieve when ISHR and human rights were not so much seen as a cost center, but as a structural investment for the future of the UN. It's definitely not in line with the call to action, not in line with the Summit of the Future. And so my recommendation, and building up on what the DPR from France introduced as an opening remark, I would say yes, absolutely to efficiency, but let's also not forget effectiveness. Effectiveness in the delivery of those mandates, in the delivery of human rights, not as nice add-ons to the mandates of the UN, but has a proper pillar.
So, just want to open the floor to questions. Does anyone have any remarks they want to share or questions they want to ask our panelists before we close? Just stunned you all. So much information. Yeah. Okay, oh, we have one over there.
Thank you very
Go
much.
ahead.
Have two great guys that you to all of European institutions. I'm a 5C delegate from Austria, and in that capacity I have a question to people, of course. If you could just briefly educate me on, you said just now that ISHR is differently affected by the liquidity crisis as more vacancy posts. Could you explain why it has more vacancy posts than, for example, the development field? And is there from my perspective?
Thank you for that question. Full transparency, we're neighbors in France, so I'll hold you accountable for asking that question by offering you a copy. That's a tricky question, and the first point in answering it is probably to highlight that all departments are affected across the UN by the liquidity situation. So it's not that OICHR only is impacted, but the nature of the operations of OICHR, that's what I was using as an example for the first myth debunking. The nature of the operations of OICHR means that the new mandates that are created require new posts for those mandates to be implemented. So when the HRC creates and adopts new mandates, OICHR comes to the General Assembly and requests the different posts that correspond to that mandate for that mandate to be implemented. When other departments like DESA, the Regional Economic Commissions, are concerned, their organization and structure is more about supporting other processes. So the mandates that create those processes already fill those positions, but DESA itself has the capacity to support them, and usually is able to absorb that capacity. So that's why you see, through just the reality of how mandates are created and the different nature of mandates, why OICHR is more impacted by this liquidity situation, because it's not able to recruit the people that actually implement its mandates.
Super helpful, thank you. Anyone else have any questions, remarks, comments? No? Okay, so we're going to close the event. Thank you very much to all of you who joined and to our speakers. What we've heard today makes one thing very clear. The fight for adequate and sustainable funding for UN human rights work is not technical, it's deeply political. And it goes to the very heart of what kind of UN we want to see in the years ahead. The report, which will be out online as of this afternoon, we've had a few questions.
15 minutes.
15 minutes. It was embargoed until 3 p.m. Shows that decisions made in rooms that most people never see, the Fifth Committee, the ACBQ, the VOA, the other budgetary bodies, have profound consequences for people around the world. Budget. When human rights mandates go unfunded, field offices close, investigations are delayed, canceled, it's victims and defenders who are paying the price for that. But the discussions here today have also shown that there's a path forward. Member states that believe in this system from every region, we're counting on you. You can and you must step up. You can insist on transparency, accountability in the budget processes, you can pay contributions in full and on time, and you can ensure that human rights are treated not as a political bargaining chip, but as a shared and indispensable responsibility. We look forward to the UN 80 reform process and beyond. This is a moment to reaffirm a simple truth. The UN that fails to fund human rights cannot credibly protect them. ISHR remains committed to working with all of you, diplomats, UN officials, civil society, to ensure that the human rights pillar is not just protected, but strengthened. So thank you again for being here for today and for your partnership and your commitment.
Doing well? Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just gonna stop the live
No worries.
stream.